name is Mistie Kozerski, and I'm a student and a parent. In February, I received a voicemail from my son's principal, and she said that she'd like to have a meeting with me regarding my son's behavior. And this is a call that every parent dreads, but I wasn't surprised. During the meeting, she told me that my son is disorganized, and he has a hard time paying attention in class. She went on to suggest that we take our son to see the family physician to be screened for ADHD, and that medication may be beneficial for him. In just 5 minutes, she had diagnosed, labeled, and recommended a treatment for my son. We have to remember that this woman is an elementary principal and she's not a doctor. So without confirming my son's condition, she jumped to the conclusion that he should be put on a psychotropic drug. So my first reaction was to think, lady, you're crazy. But instead of telling her off, I politely thanked her for her input, and I told her that I didn't necessarily agree that he had ADHD and that medication would be beneficial for him. I wasn't seeing these behaviors at home either. So I left her office frustrated because I'd been studying psychology at Des Moines Area Community College, and I knew that my son did not fit the DSM-5 criteria for ADHD. While I'll admit that my son is disorganized, a quick peek into his room will prove this, he doesn't seem to have a persistent pattern of inattention or often fails to have close attention to details or makes careless mistakes, and I just don't see those issues at home. So my concern is that the teachers and the administrators are jumping to diagnose and they want to medicate the children. These unfound and unqualified diagnoses create a dangerous ripple effect through the lives of children. If unqualified people in these positions of power are armchair diagnosing our children, it could lead to larger problems in our children in the future. I've had many meetings and phone calls with these people, and most of them seem to lead to the same conclusion. My son has a psychological problem and that he needs to be on medication. The day after the meeting, my principal emailed me this chart. This chart is supposed to show how many times a child has done something that they're not supposed to do. It's a disciplinary chart. So as a parent, I look at this graph and I think, you know, way to go, he's above average. And then I said, well, wait a second. And I tried to look at it as a scholar, and statistically this information does not show a persistent pattern of inattention. Instead, he's only slightly above normal, and he's only had a couple of bad weeks. So this chart was leading the principal to believe that my son should be medicated. And it isn't very specific. It's titled Any Tally for Any Reason. So I don't know if my son is disorganized, if he's acting out in class, if he's distracting other children, or if he's eating dirt. So I'll admit this is a piece of information, but it's only a piece to the puzzle. So 3 weeks later, at a parent-teacher conference, I received this chart. I didn't really get a chance to look at it because I only had a 15-minute conference with the teacher. So when I went home, I looked at it a little bit more closely, and I got to see what his marks were actually for. Everything on this chart is a criteria for ADHD, and he only seems to be having problems in 2 of these areas, which is incomplete homework and preparedness for class. So the DSM criteria states that a child must have 6 or more of the following symptoms for 6 or more months. This shows 2 symptoms over a range of about 2 months. So he does have a hard time with incomplete homework and preparedness for class, more than he has a hard time with following directions and being off task. After these conversations with the teachers and looking at all my information, I decided to talk to my son and see why he felt he was having a hard time in class. He admitted that he is disorganized and he forgets to bring his stuff to class. So I asked him why he thought he had a hard time concentrating in class. And he said, "Mom, I'm always tired and bored at school." So this isn't news to me. Every morning, I feel like a snooze button. I'm constantly waking him up over and over again. And so I can see why he's tired. Being tired is often associated with somebody who has ADHD, but doctors also believe that many people are being misdiagnosed with ADHD when they're really having sleeping problems. ADHD and being tired have many of the same observable actions: poor concentration, and a tendency to forget things. So I asked my son why he thinks he's tired, and his reply was, because I share a room with my brother and he snores. So I'm not surprised that the school faculty were concerned about Skylar. I am concerned though that they're jumping to the conclusion that he had ADHD and he needed medication. They're not doctors, and they only see my son in a limited capacity. It turns out I'm not the only person seeing this. In 2004, the government passed a law prohibiting mandatory medication in schools. Before this law was passed, the teachers in the school could force a parent to put their son or daughter on a prescription medication as a condition for attending the school. So unfortunately, this law allows teachers and other school personnel the right to share classroom-based observations with parents or guardians regarding a school's academic and functional performance or behavior in the classroom. And this is where things get a little bit fuzzy. The teachers and the school personnel can make observations about a child's behavior, but what I'm seeing and a lot of other parents are seeing is that these teachers are sharing their conclusions about what is going on with the child, and they're making a diagnosis on that information. But because these are not trained professionals in the mental health field, then this is a fuzzy scenario, and it sometimes can lead to a misdiagnosis and unnecessary medication that can have adverse side effects for the children. This situation can be even more dangerous when teachers and school personnel share their observations to an excess. I was getting at least 2 emails a week, and I was having at least 1 meeting a month. These meetings were causing me to skip some of my classes and to be late for work sometimes. In these conversations, I constantly felt the pressure of believing that my child did have ADHD and needed to be on medication. And I never felt that they were listening to me, and they were so trying to push me with these recommendations. I started second-guessing myself because there were so many people coming at me, and I occasionally had the thought that if I just put my son on these drugs, it would all go away. So they were wearing me down, but fortunately, I have a good support system. I have an education, I have a husband, and I had time to consider these suggestions. I feel for the mothers who are working 4 jobs to make ends meet, because they may not have the time or the confidence to stand up for this. If they can't afford to get fired or to miss work, they're going to be more inclined to go along with these suggestions, because these are the teachers and they're the experts after all. So what happens when other parents are in the same situation, but they don't have the knowledge about the diagnostic criteria, and they don't know if this amateur diagnosis by the school is accurate? Just the other day, I was discussing this project with one of my classmates, and she said, "Oh, it's easy to know if your child has ADHD. You can just go online and take one of those online quizzes. It will tell you if your child has ADHD." I didn't say anything, but in the back of my mind, I was thinking how easy it would be to misdiagnose yourself or your child by doing one of these online quizzes, because a serious mental disorder is not the same as a test your sex IQ at cosmopolitan.com. So I was suspicious, but I checked out these quizzes and I Googled ADH. Google recommended I looked at ADHD, ADHD tests, and ADHD symptoms. I decided to check out the ADHD test. The first 2 websites were self-tests for ADHD. It wasn't until the 3rd result that I saw there's not a single test for ADHD available. So of course we all know the problem with Googling a term is that Google is going to keep track of our search. The next time that same user uses Google for ADHD, it will remember the search for the ADHD tests. Google will keep directing searcher back into the same direction, and they're going to continuously get the same information, which is going to cause them to believe that their information is true and confirmed. This is the digital version of what psychologists call the confirmation bias. This confirmation bias works like this. Our brains want to see patterns and make connections. As much as we want to think we're objective and logical, we're really not. If we believe something to be true, we have a tendency to look for evidence that backs up our belief, but we tend to ignore the evidence to the contrary. An example of confirmation bias is if a teacher suggests that a child has ADHD to the parent. The parent goes online and takes this quiz. Even if this quiz is not 100% conclusive, the parent is more likely to believe that the kid has ADHD, and they have proof that they're right, to the exclusion of seeing anything that they are wrong. This tendency makes sense in the light of the fact that a poorly behaved child is a baffling, mysterious, and a troubling situation. Rather than considering that a child's behavior could be any number of combinations or reactions to complicated factors, we're eager to see the simple and medicatable solutions. Where this really gets dangerous is in the doctor's office. Because the parent has done the research and they feel that their conclusions are correct, they may push for an official diagnosis for their child. In this situation, because the parent feels that they know so much about this situation and about this diagnosis, they have all the information to give it to their doctor. And the doctor may go along with what the patient and the parent say because there really, as we said before, there is no official diagnosis or test for this diagnosis. One pseudo-diagnosis leads to the next and the next until we've created a self-fulfilling prophecy. The consequences for a child with ADHD are very serious and long-term, but as we reach these conclusions, it may be through layers of misdiagnosis and bad science. In an ideal world, a child who actually does have ADHD would be treated with cognitive behavioral therapy. And then if the therapy doesn't work, we would add medication onto it. But never ever should a child be on medication alone. Unfortunately, this is not what we're seeing in the schools. I talked to several school professionals, including a paraeducator, a guidance counselor, and a parent. I asked each one of them if they had ever heard of a school recommending therapy for a child, and not one of them had. But when I asked them if they had heard a recommendation for medication, all of them had heard it multiple times. So, for one, these people are not qualified to make this diagnosis, and two, they're making the wrong recommendation for this diagnosis. Medicating a child with a mood-altering drug is incredibly serious. A child prescribed to a stimulant such as Adderall or Ritalin could have major side effects, including stunting of growth, loss of appetite, and a hard time falling asleep. Along with these medical side effects, there's sociological and psychological side effects as well. Besides that, these drugs have not been tested in children and they are not FDA approved for children. What's even more striking is that the medication may not be effective. Researchers at the National Institute on Drug Abuse found virtually no difference between a group of subjects diagnosed with ADHD who were treated with cognitive therapy and were put on medication versus a group with ADHD that was on cognitive therapy and a placebo pill. ADHD is the second most frequent long-term diagnosis made in children in the United States, following shortly behind asthma. Of course, we could be seeing more of these diagnoses because we understand more about ADHD, but it could also be because it's a catch-all diagnosis for the behaviors of children that don't fit into our expectations. Yet regardless of how a child comes to that diagnosis, the consequences are no less severe. When a child is labeled with the disorder, they're often treated differently. When a child is treated as if they have ADHD, they will sometimes start manifesting the behaviors. If a child wasn't paying attention or hasn't completed their homework, the teacher may keep that child in from recess just to catch up on the work. And if this child is not allowed the opportunity to relax, they may be more distracted in class. My son said that the way they treated him, they treat me like a baby. They always check on me and remind me about everything and ask me if I paid attention to what was said. To me, that doesn't teach him how to be a better student. That just teaches him that there's going to be someone there to constantly give him reminders. Even though I disagree with how the school handled the situation with my child, I can understand their motives. And I truly believe they have the best interest of my child in heart. Teachers often have an average of 30 students in their class, and they have to keep track of lots of information. It would be hard to expect the teacher to connect with each student and know what each one needs at all times. Some of these kids might have ADHD, and they might need special attention, and it's easy to see how a teacher would feel desperate in these situations. I don't have an answer on how to escape the cycle. It's a complicated problem, and it's going to require a multifaceted solution. Parents need to take time to get to know their children and what their learning styles are. And parents need to be a suspicious advocate for their children. If they start having these meetings with the school administrators, parents need to listen to the observations of these problems, because these problems, they do exist. But the solutions they're suggesting, they need to be highly suspect. School administrators, they need to stick to the observations, and they need to leave the diagnosis to the professionals. They should also be willing to work with the students and parents on a multi-pronged approach to behavior modification. Every situation is going to be different, and sometimes what looks like a psychological problem could in fact be a medical problem. So don't necessarily focus on the diagnosis, but focus on the root cause of the problem behaviors. With my son, I stood my ground. I asked for options, and eventually I met with the special education teacher to discuss different things we could try in the classroom. The first thing we tried was a positive reinforcement system. If my son turned in his homework, he got a prize. But the thing is the positive reinforcement didn't work with my son because he didn't care about the prizes. He handed it out to the other kids in his class. So because of this, he was still forgetting his homework and he was still forgetting his books. So we came up with a checklist. He now has a checklist on his desk every day. And at the end of the day, he checks off the stuff as he puts it in his backpack so that he no longer forgets his items. With the use of this checklist in the classroom and at home, my son has now been turning in his homework on a regular basis, and he's been getting good grades. Now I'm still getting all the communication from the teachers, but I'm getting it because he's been doing so much better in class, and his grades have started to come up. I'm glad I did not give in to the pressure of the school because my son Skylar has made huge improvements, and he did it all without the medication. So in the end, the solution for Skylar wasn't necessarily the easiest, but it was simple. My hope is that other parents and school administrators will realize that this is a team effort and that everyone needs to play the role that they're assigned and not other people's roles because that's not what they're qualified for. I'm hoping that the best interest of the child is in everyone's heart and mind.